Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. This is Anatomy and Physiology 1. I hope that you will take the time to listen to these lectures and get what you can from these to move forward. Anatomy and Physiology is a very difficult class because most of the problem is with the terminology. Terminology takes a lot of time in order to gain a real knowledge base and be able to work with it. So that's what we're going to try to do as we work through this course. Let's move forward and talk about this picture. Now, when you look at this picture, you see this group of doctors huddled around a patient, and they all have something to say. The first one says, "How's the spleen?" The other one says, "The spleen, where is it?" Then the third one says, "I never studied the spleen." Then you hear, "I was left back in my spleen class. I failed the spleen. I thought we didn't even have to know the spleen." So it lets you become aware very quickly that if you don't have a knowledge base on certain topics, especially during surgery, and I hope you never run into this situation, that it can be very confusing. Hopefully the patient is out at this time, but it can be a very confusing scenario. So everybody needs to be on the same page and speaking the same language. So the term anatomy means the study of structure or form, and we will talk about physiology later, but I will tell you that physiology refers to function. And as I said earlier, mastery of anatomical terminology is really important to having an appreciation, understanding for what you are going to be talking about in each of the chapters that we will be taking on during the 2-semester course. So that's very important. Now, some of the words, just for example, some of these you've heard of. Dissection is cutting or separation of tissues to reveal their relationships to each other. This is done quite often during an autopsy. And some of the coursework that you will do and some classes that you had maybe in the past require dissecting animal organs, maybe a sheep heart or a fetal pig, or years ago we used to do cats. I didn't really appreciate doing that so much, but these are things to help you appreciate how different parts of bodies are put together and how they relate to each other. Cadaver is a word for a dead human body. The word palpation means feeling something with your fingertips, like through the surface of the skin, like taking a pulse, feeling for glands that are swollen, or palpating for a blood vessel if you're going to be, if you're a phlebotomist and you're taking blood from somebody's arm. Percussion is tapping on the body and listening to the sound for signs of abnormalities. Sometimes if you have congestion or consolidation, fluid buildup in the lungs, or something that happens with bronchitis or pneumonia when you get consolidation, you have a totally different sound in that region, or looking for pockets of air even in certain areas. So percussion, tapping the body, listening to sounds for abnormalities, like if you were looking for a stud in a wall, and it's a different sound than you would hear if there was no stud behind the sheetrock. It sounds a little hollow in those locations. So these are just some examples of terms that are used in anatomical studies and possibly in the lab or in the clinical setting. Now, the term gross anatomy refers to structures that can be seen by the naked eye. Microscopic anatomy refers to the study of structures that are too small to be seen with the naked eye, and you need a microscope to see these. More specifically, cytology refers to the study of the cells themselves, individual cells, and histology refers to the study of tissues. And you can put several different parts of words together. Histo means tissue. Patho means diseases. Ology means study of. So throw it all together. Histopathology refers to the study of tissue diseases. So, physiology, the study of the function of the body. Remember, anatomy is structure. And the function relates to various organ systems. So we have many organ systems. For example, with the kidney, the function of the kidney is referred to as renal physiology. And if you're looking at the heart and how the heart and blood vessels work together to pump this important liquid that provides nutrients, oxygen, takes away waste products to your tissue cells, this is called cardiovascular physiology. All body systems work together to keep the body in balance. None really work independently. They all depend upon each other. They work together as a unit. So going back, I don't know how much they do today in the earlier grades, but back when I was in high school, the scientific method was the method that was used to develop paradigms of scientific thought. And it goes back to, early times where somebody made an observation and posed a question about something they observed, and then they would make a guess as to why they thought that was going on. That's called the hypothesis. And then to reinforce or prove your hypothesis, you would design an experiment. And that would be a series of events that you would perform. And then once the experiments were done, then you analyze the data, record the results from the experiments conducted, and your conclusions either prove or disprove your hypothesis. And if your hypothesis was correct, you have to be able to repeat this, and then you could report it to the scientific community as a whole, and then they would repeat it all over the world. People would try to repeat your experiments and make sure that your hypothesis was correct. One of the other things about the scientific method is when you're conducting experiments, you have to have a control, something that you leave the situation the same, and then you have to have a variable, something that you change. It's like if plants are growing in the window and you see the leaves migrating towards the sunlight, your observation could be, I see that the plant leaves are growing towards the sun. And then your hypothesis may be, I think they need the sunlight to grow. And so then you design an experiment where your control would be to leave some of the plants in the sunlight, to not change that particular thing, and then you put some of them in the dark, and those are your variables. Those are the ones you're changing. And then over time, you're going to look and see how they do over the course of the next few weeks, and you should find out that the plants really do need the sunlight to grow, and the ones that are in the sunlight will do much better than the ones that are in the dark. So that's basically what the scientific method is all about. There are variations of this. Some books will use 3 steps, some use 5 steps. But just to have a general idea of what a hypothesis is and to know the sequence of events in conducting bodies of scientific knowledge that can be published and can be used to build paradigms of scientific information. There are levels of structural organization. And you first start off with the chemical level. This is where you start with small, indivisible types of structures that are called atoms. We're going to spend some time in Chapter 2 talking about atoms. And atoms go together to make molecules. And then, if you take molecules and you put them together, you can build bigger structures that you would find that make up the organelles. And this is in Chapter 3. And organelles are the little tiny organs that you find in cells. So the chemical structure is Chapter 2, and then building up into cells is Chapter 3. From cells, you go into tissues, and tissues are groups of similar cells. That's Chapter 4. And then you can take 2 or more tissues and put them together, and then you can produce an organ, like a stomach or a blood vessel or something like that. That's an organ. And then you can take groups of organs that work together, like the stomach and the intestines and the esophagus, and those organs work together and they make an organ system. And then all the organ systems put together make up the organism. So here it is in picture form, and you can see atoms. This is the chemical level. Atoms combine to form molecules. There's some atoms joined together to make a molecule. And then molecules we put together to make a organelle. Some of you may already know that this organelle is the mitochondria, the powerhouse. And then you put your mitochondria together with all the other organelles, and here you're going to make a cell, and this is a smooth muscle cell. And remember that cells are made up of molecules. And then the smooth muscle cells all weave together to make a sheet of a tissue that this becomes smooth muscle tissue. And then you combine that smooth muscle tissue with other types of tissue like connective tissue on the outside, epithelial on the inside. We haven't gotten to these yet, but we will. And that becomes this organ that's called a blood vessel. And then you take all the different organs that are made up of different types of tissues, put them all together, and you're going to make an organ system. So the cardiovascular system is the heart and your blood vessels, and they work very closely together. Remember we said earlier they pump blood throughout the body, and then you take all the various organ systems and you put them together to make the organism. Now on page 1 of the notes, it mentions the 11 body systems. And I'll just go over these briefly before we get to the characteristics of life. So you have the integumentary system, which is the skin, the skeletal system, muscular, nervous, endocrine, circulatory, lymphatic, respiratory, urinary, digestive, and reproductive systems. And there's a 12th, and this is called the immune system. Now, I also mentioned an unusual anatomy called situ inversus. And you will find that 1 in 8,000 people have this condition where the organs are reversed. And the heart's toward the right side of the body, the stomach's on the right, the liver's on the left. And situ inversus is an unusual condition, but it does occur in people. So the location of the organs generally is true for most people, but because we talk about locations of organs and body cavities, but there are some abnormalities, and situ inversus is one of those. All right, so let's move on to characteristics of life. The definitions of these are in the notes. Maintaining boundaries. Cells have boundaries. They have what's called the cell membranes. And then we have the skin that helps to protect living things from invasion of foreign substances from the outside. So boundaries are very important. And you'll find out very quickly that the skin, the unbroken skin, is one of the most important boundaries that we have. So to keep us from being infected from the outside, the skin is a very important barrier. Movement. And movement can be either from place to place or movement of substances internally, like the blood moving through the body, the immune cells moving from place to place, keeping watch to make sure you're not having an infection from the outside. Peristalsis that happens in the GI tract. So there's a lot of movement that goes on inside too. Responsiveness is the ability of an organism to sense and react to stimuli or changes in the environment. If a person is unresponsive, then you have to do certain types of assessment to see what's going on and if there's a coma involved or what's making the person unresponsive. So being able to engage and be cognitive of what's happening around you. Digestion. Being able to break down the food products that are ingested. Cells do it individually, and we do it as an organism. Metabolism. Metabolism is a word that you're going to see quite often, so I would make sure that I really got this definition down as soon as I could. It is the sum total of all the chemical reactions that are occurring in the body or in the organism. the sum total of all chemical reactions occurring in the body. And it is connected with two terms that put together actually make up or add up to metabolism. And one of them is called anabolism. These are on the notes. And anabolism is where you take smaller pieces and put them together to make more complex structures. So by taking atoms and making them into molecules, that's an anabolic process. The other one is catabolism, and that's breaking things down, like taking molecules and making them into atoms. So the building up process of anabolism combined with the breaking down product of catabolism, all those reactions that are occurring in the body simultaneously at the same time, that is really metabolism. So the sum total of all these anabolic and catabolic reactions that are taking place in the body. Excretion is the disposal of waste products. So removing waste from the body is excretion, and their elimination. So we're constantly making waste products. We have urination, we have CO2 that we get rid of through respiration, we have defecation, sweating removes some uric acid, lactic acid, so there's many different ways to remove waste products. And reproduction. Reproduction, all living things can produce copies of themselves and genetic information and traits to their offspring. And this can even happen on the cellular level, not always in speaking of sexual reproduction, but cells replicate and make copies of themselves. You replace your skin on average every month, your epithelium, epidermis. So it's constantly going on. Growth is an increase in size. So cells get bigger, then they divide. There's a lot of things that go on. So these are all the things that are needed for something to be categorized as a living thing. The next thing we'll talk about is survival needs. And there is an appropriate amount necessary of all of these things for life. Now, too much or too little can be harmful. So your nutrients include carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. Those are your three major categories of nutrients. And then you also need smaller amounts of substances called vitamins and minerals. And oxygen is a requirement. You absolutely have to have water. Normal body temperature, 98.6, which equates to 37.2 degrees Celsius. And appropriate atmospheric pressure, which is important for respiration. So those are survival needs. Now the term homeostasis refers to the ability to maintain a relatively stable internal condition despite continuous changes in the environment. Things are constantly changing around us. When you go outside and it's 95 degrees and humid, you're going to sweat to try to keep the body at the right temperature. So it's a dynamic state of equilibrium, trying to keep the seesaw balanced, keep everything in a balanced condition. And remember, we always said the organ systems work together. So to keep this balance, it's maintained by contributions of all the organ systems working together. So how do we keep this balance? Well, there's feedback systems. And a feedback system is a system that helps to either amplify or shut down a situation. So let's talk about a feedback system. So the first thing we have negative feedback. Okay, negative feedback is a process in which the body senses a change and activates the mechanisms that negate it or reverse it. Just for a simple example, like I said with sweating. The temperature's rising, the core temperature starts to go up, so the body starts to release a lot of heat through sweating. A lot of heat is removed through liquid. So this is one way of being able to try to change that situation that's happening. So here's the components of a control mechanism. And I use this example because it's something we may be familiar with because we all have furnaces in our home. The air conditioning systems also work in a similar fashion, but we're going to use a heating system in the home. So in a feedback system, you have a receptor, a control center, and an effector that puts out a response. So a receptor, control center, and effector. So the receptor is something that senses a change, okay? Like a thermometer in a thermostat. It monitors the environment, responds to stimuli, something that causes changes in control variables. The control center is the thermostat. The thermostat determines the set point at which the variable is maintained. You set the thermostat to a certain temperature, and it's supposed to keep it around that point. So it receives input from the receptor, and it determines the appropriate response. The effector would be the furnace, and the furnace receives the output from the control center and provides the means to respond. So if the temperature drops below what you set the thermostat for, then the furnace will be turned on. And once it reaches that desired point, then the furnace turns off. So respond either reduces negative feedback or enhances the stimulus as positive feedback. So these are the three parts of a control mechanism. Most of the systems of the body operate under a negative feedback system, okay? And you want to keep that in mind. There's very few positive feedback mechanisms in the body where the output is amplified and continues. This is looking at changes in body temperature. So if the temperature rises, receptors in the skin send that stimulus by an afferent pathway, don't worry about the terms for now, to the control center, which is the hypothalamus in the brain, and then the outgoing response is to the effectors, which are sweat glands, and they produce the sweat. Evaporation of sweat, the body temperature falls, and the stimulus ends. So we're on the same thing about sweating. And on the other hand, if it becomes very cold, body temperature falls. The receptors, temperature receptors in the skin, the brain, send that information to the hypothalamus. And then your effectors here now are the muscles, and you're going to start shivering. And that little movement in muscles, the shivering, will produce some heat, and that's going to increase the temperature. And once the temperature goes back to normal, shuts off the feedback system. So really good example there. Positive feedback, like I said, not as common. It's a self-amplifying cycle in which a physiological change leads to even greater change in the same direction. So there's two examples: platelet aggregation. When you have an injury to a blood vessel, the platelets will aggregate. As they come together, they break down and they release chemical agents that are called platelet aggregating factors that will draw in more and more platelets. So it's a self-perpetuating type of system. And oxytocin production during childbirth to increase the strength, the intensity of the contractions that lead to the birth of the child. So this is your positive feedback mechanism with platelet aggregation, break or tear in a blood vessel wall that starts the cycle by platelets. Those factors from the blood vessels will induce the platelets to be attracted there. Platelets adhere, release their chemicals, and then the platelet plug is fully formed, and the cycle will end once that plug is formed. And this is a positive feedback loop. Actually, what stops a positive feedback loop is usually something independent of the mechanism itself. There are platelet inhibitory factors that are produced by cells of surrounding blood vessel wall epithelial cells. They usually knock it out. So it's a little bit more tricky, and I don't want to get into too much detail with that at this time, but just remember, negative feedback, where the output of the system, once that system maintains its homeostatic balance, it shuts the system off. Negative feedback is much more common than positive feedback mechanisms. Okay, so let's move on to the anatomical position. This is a standard body position that's used to reference regions of the body, so we're all on the same page, so we know what we're talking about, what the position of the body is, when we're talking about what one part of the body is, where it's related to another part. So here are the different aspects, okay? The body's erect, you're standing straight, feet slightly apart, palms facing forward is the only thing that's probably a little bit abnormal. You usually don't stand with your palms facing towards the front. But you use directional terms, which we're going to get into here shortly, as if the body is in the anatomical position. Right and left refer to the body being viewed, not those of the observer. Something to keep in mind when you are labeling diagrams. If you're labeling a heart diagram, the left to you on your left side is actually the right. So you want to keep that in mind. All right, so here's directional terms. These are terms that are going to help you to be able to form sentences and be able to talk about the location of one part of the body in relation to another part of the body. So the term superior means towards the head, which another word is cranial. So towards the head end or upper part of the structure or body, it means above. So see how the arrow is pointing upwards? And here's a way you can use it. The head is superior to the abdomen because the head is above the abdomen. Inferior is towards the tail, and caudal means tail. So this is away from the head end or towards the lower part of the structure of the body. It means below. So remember, superior is above, inferior is below. So you can say the navel, the belly button, is inferior to the chin because it's below the chin. Now I want you to keep in mind, because we're going to talk about a couple of another pair of terms later on. I don't want you to get confused. But superior and inferior are generally used to refer to structures in the head and axial part of the body. Not the limbs, not the arms and legs, okay? But just like the head and the trunk area. So keep that in mind. Superior, inferior, usually not in reference to limbs. Now, ventral or anterior means the same thing, towards the front, okay? So in front of. So if you look at the body now from the side, the breastbone is anterior to the spine, and you could say the breastbone is ventral to the spine. Dorsal or posterior means just the opposite, towards the back of the body or behind. The heart is posterior to the breastbone because it's behind the breastbone. So two pairs of words that mean opposite things, and using them in sentences to relate one part of the body to the position of another part. Medial means towards the midline. So if you drew a midline down the middle of the body, medial means towards the midline. And like an example would be, the heart is medial to the arm because the heart is closer to the midline than the arm is. Lateral is away from the midline of the body, and the arms are lateral to the chest because they're further away from the midline than the chest is. Now, if you had three items, you could use the word intermediate. And intermediate is in between a more medial structure and a more lateral structure. Like the collarbone is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. So another pair of terms, proximal, distal. This is where you're talking about the limbs. Remember, I said superior and inferior are talking about mainly axial structures like the head and the trunk, abdomen, all that region. Proximal means closer to the origin of the body part, or the point of attachment of a limb to the body, to the trunk of the body. So you're talking about its relationship to the point of attachment. So here's an example. The elbow is proximal to the wrist because the elbow is closer to the point of attachment of the arm than the wrist is. Get it? If you use the definition and throw it in the sentence, it'll automatically tell you whether you're using the right word or not. So knowing the definition of these words is really important to using them. Distal means farther away from the origin of a body part or the point of attachment. So the knee is distal to the thigh because the knee is further away from the point of attachment of the leg than the thigh is. Okay, so the knee is distal to the thigh. Last pair of terms, superficial and deep. Superficial means closer to the surface. Deep is away from the body's surface. So using superficial, the skin is superficial to the skeletal muscles because it's actually on the surface, right? And then deep, the lungs are deep to the skin because they're further inside. So that takes care of your directional terms. So now if we take regional terms now, there's two major divisions of the body, and you already heard I used that term axial. Axial refers to the head, neck, and trunk regions of the body. Appendicular are the limbs. So those are two major divisions of the body. And this next couple of pictures, we're going to be looking at regional terms, and regional terms will designate specific areas within body divisions. So directional terms, we're just relating one part of the body where it is in relationship to another body part. Axial and appendicular, dividing the body into two major regions, head, neck, trunk, limbs. And then the next pictures are talking about actual regions. And the reason why I put these pictures up here is because as we go through, you're going to see a lot of these regions used to make or to name blood vessels, nerves, muscles, bones. In certain regions, some of the names of the region will give you an idea or a clue as to what the name of that particular vessel or muscle can be. So you have brachial. Brachial refers to upper arm. You have axillary. Axillary in the armpit region. And you'll see that there are names of different structures, blood vessels, and muscles that are associated with these particular types of regions. So be prepared to use these terms, and that's why I put it there. If you have some time, try to get familiar with these various regions. Like, say for example, frontal. The frontal part is where the forehead is, and you're going to have a frontalis bone that makes up that part of the forehead. You're also going to have a frontalis muscle that overlies that bone. So frontal bone, frontalis muscle, associated with that particular region. So again, just familiarize yourself with terms that you may see popping up here and there because they're named for those regions. That's the front, that's the back. Body planes. There are three common planes, and they lie at right angles to each other, and you should be familiar with the planes' names and how they divide the body. The sagittal plane divides the body into left and right halves. The frontal, also called the coronal plane, separates the body into anterior and posterior sections, means it separates the front from the back. And then the transverse, also called a horizontal plane, divides the body into superior and inferior parts. So let's look at the picture. There's your sagittal plane, okay? It comes through the midline of the body and divides the body into left and right halves. It's also called a median plane. Sometimes these planes have different names, unfortunately. Frontal or coronal plane, see how it goes through and it separates the front from the back. And then here's your transverse plane, a horizontal plane, divides the body into upper part and an upper part and a lower part. And this is what you would be looking at MRI scans, various planes of the body, and what you would see. So a frontal section through the torso could give you a look at the lungs, the heart, the various organs, the liver, the stomach. And here you have a transverse section through the torso, and you can see here, it is small, but there's the aorta cut cross-sectionally, and there's looking at a vertebrae. Okay, there's the spine of the vertebrae. There's the liver, there's the spleen, pretty cool. And then a median section, now you can get a look at the whole vertebral column from the side. And also some of the intestines here. So depending upon the plane, will depend upon what these various organs are going to look like when you're viewing them through a scan. Now we go to body cavities. So there's two sets of internal body cavities. These are closed to the environment, and they provide different degrees of protection to organs. Many of your cavities are contained with bony surroundings, are a skeletal structure that surrounds them to protect them. Like the brain being enclosed in the cranial cavity. The brain is very soft, and so the skull protects it. Okay, so dorsal body cavity consists of the cranial and vertebral cavities, so that's dorsal is in the back, and then ventral is in the front, and that consists of the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. So two major cavities, back, front, and then there's subdivisions. So the yellow looking color, that's your dorsal body cavity. So at the top you see the cranial cavity that contains the brain, that's all surrounded by bone. And then your vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. So the vertebrae are your protective bony structures there. So cranial cavity, vertebral cavity together make up the dorsal body cavity. We're looking at the side. This is a lateral view from the side. Now you can see your ventral body cavity is in red, and that's subdivided into the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. Flip it to the front, and now you can see that the thoracic cavity is subdivided into pleural cavities, and the pleural cavities, I'll tell you, house the lungs, so one for each lung. And then in the middle, you have the mediastinum, some people say mediastinum, but the upper part is for larger passageways like the trachea, the esophagus, and then down here, the lower part of the mediastinum is where you have the heart. That's where the pericardial cavity is that contains the heart. The dividing point between the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity is the diaphragm. Makes a nice little landmark there. So your abdominal cavity contains most of your digestive organs. You have your stomach, and then you have your liver, spleen, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, and then you get into the pelvic cavity, and that's where you have house the female reproductive organs, bladder, lower part of the large intestine. So that makes up your body cavities. Be familiar with your subdivisions, your main cavities, where major organs would be found. Very important. Now, membranes in the ventral body cavity, some of your organs move. And if tissues were rubbing against each other, they'd produce a lot of friction. So you have to have a situation where you reduce the friction, and this is where these serous membranes come in. A serous membrane collectively is called serosa, and it's a thin double-layered membrane that one layer of this membrane is attached to the organ itself, the organ that moves. The other layer is attached to the cavity the organ's contained within, and then there's fluid in between. So the layer that attaches to the organ itself is called the visceral serosa. So it covers the internal organ that we're talking about. And this is a very general term, visceral layer. Now, the layer that lines the cavity the organ's contained in is called the parietal serosa. So it lines the internal body cavity wall. So this one covers the organ, the visceral, and this one lines the body cavity. And in between, there's a little slit-like cavity that's filled with serous fluid. And the serous fluid is secreted by both layers of the membrane, and that fluid helps to reduce the friction. So serous membranes have specific names depending upon which cavity and organs you're talking about. And each one has a parietal layer on the outside and visceral layer on the inside. So the one that's associated with the heart is called the pericardium. So the layer that's actually attached to the surface of the heart is called the visceral pericardium. And the one that lines the cavity the heart's contained within is called the parietal pericardium. Get it? How about pleura? Pleura are associated with the lungs. So the one that covers the surface of the lungs, visceral pleura, and the one that lines the cavities the lungs are contained within, parietal pleura. And then the last one is peritoneum, because the stomach, the intestines, they move, right? So you have the visceral peritoneum that lines the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and then the layer that lines the abdominal cavity wall is called the parietal peritoneum. So there are all your individual serous membrane names, and remember, the inner one is the visceral layer, outer one is the parietal layer. And here's a picture just showing you this relationship between these membranes. And they're using the example of a balloon. If you put your fist inside of a balloon, the rubber part of the balloon that surrounds your fist there, it covers your fist, is called the visceral layer. That's down here, the inner balloon wall. And then the outer part of the balloon would be comparable to the parietal serosa, and the air that's in the inside between those two would be comparable to the serous cavity. And here it's got air, but in the body it would be fluid that's filling that. And this is showing you a picture of the heart and showing you the visceral layer right here. It's attached right to the surface of the heart. Here's your pericardial space with your serous fluid in light blue. And then your parietal pericardium is on the outside, lining the mediastinum. So that's serous membranes, and that finished